What's up, History fam? Today we're diving into one of the most important periods in American history, like the most pivotal moment that changed everything. We're talking about Abraham Lincoln and how slavery finally ended in America during 1863 to 1865. Now, I know you've probably heard the basic story. Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. America had a civil war, the good guys won, the end. But the real story? It's way more complicated, way more political, and honestly way more interesting than what they taught you in school. This ain't about some perfect saint who woke up one day and decided to end slavery. Nah, this is about a complicated politician navigating an impossible situation, making calculated moves, dealing with massive pressure from all sides, and ultimately doing something that changed the course of human history. We're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, what it actually said and what it didn't say. We're going to talk about the 13th Amendment and how it barely passed. We're going to talk about the 4 million enslaved people who freed themselves while everyone gives Lincoln all the credit. And we're going to talk about Lincoln's assassination just days after the war ended. So buckle up, because we're going deep on how slavery ended in America, and trust me, it's not the simple story you think it is. Alright, so let's set the scene. It's January 1863. Abraham Lincoln has been president for almost 2 years, and America is literally tearing itself apart. The Civil War started in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter. 11 Southern states had seceded from the Union because they were convinced that Lincoln was going to abolish slavery. Plot twist. That wasn't even Lincoln's plan initially. He just didn't want slavery to expand into new territories. But the South was like, nah, we're out. And boom, Civil War. By 1863, the war had been going on for almost 2 years, and it was an absolute bloodbath. We're talking about the deadliest war in American history. More Americans died in the Civil War than in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Brothers fighting brothers, families torn apart, entire cities destroyed. And here's the thing a lot of people don't get. At the start of the war, Lincoln's goal was not to end slavery. His goal was to preserve the Union, keep the country together. In 1862, he literally wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." That quote makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't fit the narrative of Lincoln as this pure anti-slavery crusader. But Lincoln was a politician, and he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. See, Lincoln had to balance multiple things. He needed to win the war. He needed to keep the border states, slave states that stayed in the Union, from joining the Confederacy. He needed support from Northern Democrats who didn't care about slavery. He needed to satisfy radical Republicans who wanted immediate abolition. And he needed to do what he personally believed was right. Lincoln personally hated slavery. That's clear from his speeches and writings. But he also knew that if he made the war about slavery too early, he'd lose support in the North and potentially lose the border states. So for the first year and a half of the war, he insisted it was just about preserving the Union. But by mid-1862, everything was changing. The war was going badly for the Union. They were losing battles left and right. Lincoln needed something, anything, to change the momentum. And he started realizing that slavery itself was the Confederacy's biggest strength. Enslaved people were growing food, building fortifications, working in factories. They were the engine of the Confederate economy and war machine. Meanwhile, enslaved people themselves were taking matters into their own hands. Whenever Union troops got close to a plantation, enslaved people would escape and head for Union lines. They were called contraband, a term that basically meant confiscated enemy property. By 1863, thousands of formerly enslaved people were behind Union lines, many of them serving as laborers, guides, and spies for the Union Army. Lincoln started seeing that emancipation wasn't just a moral issue, it was a military strategy. If he freed the enslaved people in the Confederacy, he'd cripple the South's economy and war effort. Plus, it would transform the war's meaning. It wouldn't just be about preserving the Union anymore, it would be about freedom and justice. That could get him international support, especially from Britain and France, who had already abolished slavery and were considering supporting the Confederacy. So in the summer of 1862, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. But his cabinet told him, "Yo, you can't announce this now. We just lost a major battle. It'll look like an act of desperation." So Lincoln waited. He was looking for a Union victory to give him the credibility to make this move. That victory came in September 1862 at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, with about 23,000 casualties. It was barely a Union victory, more like a draw, but it was enough. The Confederates retreated, and Lincoln had his moment. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He basically said, "If y'all Confederate states don't come back to the Union by January 1st, 1863, I'm freeing your slaves." The Confederacy was like, "Yeah, we're good," and stayed independent. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. Alright, here's where we need to get real about what the Emancipation Proclamation actually was and what it wasn't, because there's a lot of confusion about this. What it was: a military order from the president as commander-in-chief. An executive action that declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be forever free. A game-changer that transformed the Civil War into a war about freedom and human rights. What it wasn't: a law passed by Congress. Something that freed all enslaved people in America. Even something that could be immediately enforced in most places. Here's the catch that blows people's minds. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed enslaved people in areas still in rebellion, the Confederate states. It specifically exempted the border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, that had slavery but stayed in the Union. It also exempted parts of Confederate states that were already under Union control. Think about that. Lincoln freed enslaved people in places where he had no actual power to enforce it, the Confederacy, but didn't free enslaved people in places where he did have power, the loyal border states. Why? Politics, baby. If Lincoln had tried to free enslaved people in the border states, those states might have joined the Confederacy, and the Union would have been screwed. He couldn't risk it. So on January 1st, 1863, when the proclamation took effect, how many enslaved people were actually immediately freed? Basically none. The Confederacy obviously didn't recognize Lincoln's authority, so they didn't free anybody. And the border states were exempt, so enslaved people there stayed enslaved. Does that mean the proclamation was meaningless? Hell no. Here's what it did do. First, it changed the moral character of the war. From January 1st, 1863 forward, the Civil War wasn't just about preserving the Union, it was about ending slavery. Every Union victory now meant freedom for enslaved people. That was huge for morale and for how the war was perceived internationally. Second, it gave enslaved people in the Confederacy a legal basis to claim their freedom. As Union armies advanced and took territory, enslaved people in those areas were legally free. And they knew it. Word spread through the slave grapevine like wildfire. Enslaved people started escaping in even bigger numbers, fleeing to Union lines where they knew they'd be protected. Third, it authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Before this, black men weren't allowed to serve as soldiers, though many worked as laborers and sailors. After the proclamation, black men could enlist and fight for their own freedom and the freedom of their people. By the end of the war, about 180,000 black men served in the Union Army, roughly 10% of the Union's total forces. Another 19,000 served in the Navy. These men fought in over 40 major battles and hundreds of smaller engagements. They proved that black men could fight just as bravely and effectively as white soldiers, challenging the racist assumptions of the time. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, famously depicted in the movie Glory, was one of the first black regiments. Their assault on Fort Wagner in July 1863, where they suffered massive casualties but fought with incredible courage, became a symbol of black soldiers' bravery and dedication. Black soldiers faced discrimination even while fighting. They were paid less than white soldiers initially. They usually had white officers, and if captured by Confederates, they risked being executed or re-enslaved rather than treated as prisoners of war. But they fought anyway because they knew what was at stake. Fourth, the proclamation put international pressure on the Confederacy. Britain and France had been flirting with the idea of recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation and possibly helping them. But once the war became explicitly about slavery, that became politically impossible. Both countries had abolished slavery decades earlier, and their populations were strongly anti-slavery. Supporting the Confederacy would mean supporting slavery, and they couldn't sell that to their people. So yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation had its limits, but it was still a revolutionary document that changed everything. But here's what nobody talks about enough. Enslaved people freed themselves. They didn't sit around waiting for Lincoln to save them. As soon as they could, they escaped. They sabotaged plantations. They refused to work. They gave intelligence to Union troops. They guided Union soldiers through Southern territory. They fought in the Union Army. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist and former enslaved person, understood this. He was critical of Lincoln for not going far enough, but he also recognized what the proclamation meant. He recruited black soldiers and pushed for equal treatment. He also kept pressure on Lincoln to do more. The real heroes of emancipation were the 4 million enslaved people who seized their freedom whenever they could, and the black soldiers who fought and died to make that freedom permanent. So by late 1863 and into 1864, it's becoming clear to Lincoln and everyone else that the Emancipation Proclamation isn't enough. Why? Because it was an executive order based on wartime powers. Once the war ended, it could be challenged in court. It might even be overturned. Plus, it didn't free enslaved people in the border states or in Confederate territory already under Union control. There were still hundreds of thousands of people in bondage even in Union territory. Lincoln realized that to truly end slavery permanently, they needed a constitutional amendment. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. If slavery was abolished in the Constitution itself, it would be done forever. No court could overturn it. No future president could undo it. This led to what would become the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Simple, right? Just abolish slavery in the Constitution. Easy. Wrong. Getting this passed was a political nightmare that took years and required Lincoln to use every trick in the book. Here's the deal. To pass a constitutional amendment, you need a 2/3 majority in both the House and Representatives and the Senate, then ratification by 3/4 of the states. That's a super high bar. The Senate passed their version in April 1864. They had enough radical Republicans and abolitionists to get it through. But the House? That was a different story. In June 1864, the amendment came up for a vote in the House and failed. It didn't get the 2/3 majority needed. Too many Democrats and conservative Republicans voted against it, either because they supported slavery or because they thought it went too far. Lincoln was devastated but not defeated. He made the 13th Amendment a key part of his 1864 re-election campaign. He basically said, "If you re-elect me, I'm going to get this done." The 1864 election was wild. Lincoln was running against George McClellan, his former general, who was running on a Peace Democrats platform, basically saying, "Let's just end the war and make peace with the Confederacy, even if it means accepting slavery." Lincoln thought he was going to lose. The war was dragging on, casualties were mounting, and people were exhausted. In August 1864, Lincoln literally wrote a memo saying he expected to lose and made his cabinet sign it, without telling them what it said. But then everything changed. In September, Union General William Sherman captured Atlanta, a huge Confederate city and industrial center. This was the major victory Lincoln needed. It showed that the Union was winning, that victory was possible. Then in October, Union forces won more victories. Suddenly, momentum shifted back to Lincoln. On November 8, 1864, Lincoln won re-election decisively. He took 55% of the popular vote and crushed McClellan in the Electoral College. Union soldiers, voting for the first time from the field, overwhelmingly supported Lincoln. They knew what they were fighting for. Lincoln saw this as a mandate. The people had spoken, and they wanted to end slavery permanently. Now came the real political battle, getting the 13th Amendment through the House of Representatives. This is the story told in Spielberg's movie Lincoln, which is actually pretty accurate, by the way. Lincoln and his allies had to flip at least 20 votes to get the 2/3 majority. So they went to work. We're talking about promising government jobs to outgoing Democratic congressmen who lost their elections. They had nothing to lose. Offering patronage positions to Democrats' friends and family. Applying pressure through newspaper editors and party bosses. Making backroom deals. Straight up political horse trading. Was it dirty politics? Absolutely. Was Lincoln basically bribing people? Kind of, yeah. But he was trying to end slavery, so most people give him a pass. The vote was scheduled for January 31st, 1865. The tension in the House chamber was insane. Nobody knew if they had the votes. Lincoln had delayed peace negotiations with the Confederacy because he was afraid that if peace came before the amendment passed, support for abolition would evaporate. The vote happened. One by one, representatives cast their votes. When the final tally came in, the 13th Amendment passed 119 to 56. They had barely made it. They got exactly the two-thirds they needed with just 2 votes to spare. The House chamber erupted in celebration. People were crying, hugging, celebrating in the streets. Congress had just voted to abolish slavery forever in America. But it still wasn't official. The amendment needed to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That meant 27 out of 36 states. Lincoln pushed hard for ratification, and states started approving it one by one. By the time Lincoln died in April 1865, about 20 states had ratified it. The 13th Amendment was finally ratified and became law on December 6, 1865, 8 months after Lincoln's death, when Georgia became the 27th state to approve it. Slavery was officially, permanently, legally abolished in the United States of America. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman had marched through Georgia and South Carolina, destroying everything in his path. Grant was besieging Petersburg and Richmond. The Confederate Army was running out of men, supplies, and hope. On April 2, 1865, Confederate forces evacuated Richmond, their capital. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government fled. Union troops marched into the city the next day. On April 9, 1865, Palm Sunday, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Civil War was effectively over. Grant's surrender terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could go home, keep their horses, they'd need them for farming, and wouldn't be prosecuted for treason. Lee's men were even given food rations because they were starving. When Lee surrendered, Union troops started celebrating, but Grant shut it down. He said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." He didn't want to humiliate the Confederates. He wanted reconciliation. Lincoln was thrilled. The war he'd fought for 4 years, the war that killed over 600,000 Americans, was finally ending. He started thinking about Reconstruction, how to bring the Confederate States back into the Union and help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. On April 11, 1865, Lincoln gave a speech about Reconstruction. In it, he suggested that black men who served in the Union Army or who were educated should be given the right to vote. This was radical for 1865. Even most northern states didn't let black men vote. In the crowd listening to that speech was a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a Confederate sympathizer who was furious about the Confederacy's defeat and about the idea of black men getting the vote. After hearing Lincoln's speech, Booth turned to his companion and said, "That means citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make." Booth started planning to assassinate Lincoln. On April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln and his wife Mary went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., to see a play called Our American Cousin. It was supposed to be a nice, relaxing evening after years of war and stress. Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker, was supposed to guard the door to the presidential box. But during the play, Parker left his post, probably to go get a drink. This gave Booth his opportunity. Booth was a famous actor who knew Ford's Theater well. He knew the layout, he knew the play, and he knew exactly when the audience would be laughing, which would cover the sound of a gunshot. Around 10:15 p.m., during the play's funniest scene, Booth crept into the presidential box. He pulled out a .44 caliber Derringer pistol, stepped behind Lincoln, and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln slumped forward. Mary screamed. Booth jumped from the box onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process, shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, Virginia's state motto, and escaped through the back of the theater. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house called the Peterson House. He was laid diagonally across a bed too short for his 6 feet 4 inches frame. Doctors examined him and quickly realized there was nothing they could do. The bullet had destroyed his brain. He was dying. All night, Lincoln's cabinet members, family, and friends gathered around his bedside. He never regained consciousness. His breathing became more and more labored. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at Lincoln's bedside, reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation went into mourning. People were devastated, shocked, and terrified. Lincoln had just won the war and was supposed to lead the country through peace and reconstruction. Now he was gone. Booth escaped from Washington and fled south. For 12 days, he was on the run with his co-conspirator David Harold. Booth's plot had included other assassinations of Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, but those failed or were never attempted. On April 26, 1865, Union soldiers tracked Booth to a farm in Virginia. They surrounded the barn where he was hiding and demanded he surrender. When he refused, they set the barn on fire. As Booth stumbled out, a soldier shot him. Booth died a few hours later. Lincoln's funeral train traveled from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, retracing, in reverse, the route he'd taken to Washington for his inauguration 4 years earlier. In cities along the way, millions of Americans came out to pay their respects. People lined the train tracks, crying, praying, mourning the man who had saved the Union and ended slavery. Lincoln was buried in Springfield on May 4, 1865. So what was Lincoln's legacy? What did his death mean for formerly enslaved people and for America? First, the good, slavery was ended. The 13th Amendment became law in December 1865. 4 million people who had been enslaved were now legally free. That's huge. America had finally abolished one of its greatest sins. Black soldiers had fought bravely in the war, earning respect and beginning to challenge racist assumptions. Black communities started building schools, churches, and institutions. Formerly enslaved people were reuniting with family members sold away years earlier, getting legally married, learning to read and write, and building new lives. But here's the tragedy. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, was a disaster for Reconstruction and black civil rights. Johnson was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who'd stayed loyal to the Union. Lincoln chose him as VP in 1864 to appeal to border states and war Democrats. But Johnson was racist even by 1865 standards. He didn't believe in black equality and didn't support black voting rights. Under Johnson's Reconstruction policies, former Confederate leaders returned to power in the South. Southern states passed black codes, laws designed to keep black people in a condition as close to slavery as possible. Black people were arrested for minor offenses and then forced to work on plantations through convict leasing, which is why the 13th Amendment's exception for punishment for crime is so problematic. It created a loophole. The Ku Klux Klan formed in 1865 and began a campaign of terrorism against black people and white Republicans. Congress eventually fought back, passing the 14th Amendment, citizenship and equal protection, and 15th Amendment, black male voting rights. During Radical Reconstruction 1867 to 1877, black men voted, held office, and made real political gains. But when Reconstruction ended in 1877, white Southerners reimposed white supremacy through Jim Crow laws, segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence. Black people wouldn't achieve full civil rights for another 90 years, until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So Lincoln's legacy is complicated. He ended slavery. That's undeniable and incredibly important. But the freedom black people won was incomplete and contested for generations. Was Lincoln the great emancipator? Yes, in the sense that he issued the Emancipation Proclamation and pushed through the 13th Amendment. His leadership was crucial to ending slavery. But was he the only emancipator? Hell no. Enslaved people emancipated themselves. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison fought for decades before Lincoln ever came to power. Black soldiers fought and died for freedom. White Union soldiers gave their lives to end slavery. Radical Republicans in Congress pushed for abolition. Lincoln was the right leader at the right time who made the right choices, often reluctantly, often politically, but ultimately decisively. Without him, slavery might have lasted longer. With him, it ended in 1865. That's worth remembering and honoring. Alright y'all, that's the real story of how Abraham Lincoln and millions of Americans, black and white, enslaved and free, soldiers and civilians, ended slavery in America between 1863 and 1865. It's not a simple story. It's not just Lincoln freed the slaves. It's messy, it's political, it's complicated, and it's unfinished even today. But it's our story. It's American history at its most dramatic, most important, and most transformative. From the Emancipation Proclamation to the 13th Amendment, from black soldiers fighting for freedom to Lincoln's assassination, this period changed America forever. We went from a nation half slave and half free to a nation where slavery was abolished forever. The fight for true equality continues. But it started here in these crucial years with these crucial events. Thanks for rolling with me through this deep dive. Remember, history isn't about perfect heroes. It's about complicated people making hard choices in impossible situations, and sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing. Peace out, and never forget what was sacrificed to end slavery in America.